The shortest wars in history may have lasted minutes, but their impact rippled through continents for decades. Imagine a battle that ends before you can finish a cup of coffee, the Anglo-Zanzibar War, which concluded in just 38 minutes. Now picture an entire region reshaped in 6 relentless days, as Israel seized the Sinai, the West Bank, and the Golan Heights in the 1967 Six-Day War. Consider a conflict sparked by a soccer match that boiled over into a 100-hour clash between El Salvador and Honduras, forever known as the Football War. Think of a fledgling nation defending its hard-won independence for only 10 days before a ceasefire froze the front lines in Slovenia's war against Yugoslavia. And finally, envision a 13-day showdown that not only redrew borders, but also birthed a new country, India and Pakistan's 1971 war that led to the creation of Bangladesh. These 5 brief yet explosive confrontations teach us that the length of a war does not determine its lasting significance. 1. Anglo-Zanzibar War. The year was 1896, and the tiny island of Zanzibar perched on the edge of the Indian Ocean. Sultan Hamad bin Thuwaini, who had ruled since 1893, was a loyal ally of the British Empire. When Sultan Khalid bin Bargash seized the palace after a sudden death, the British found their diplomatic plans shattered. Khalid refused to recognize the British chosen successor, Abdul Khalik, and instead proclaimed himself ruler. Britain saw the move as a direct challenge to its influence over the strategic trade hub of Zanzibar. On the night of August 25, 1896, the British consul issued an ultimatum demanding Khalid step down by 9 a.m. the next morning. Khalid ignored the demand, fortified the palace, and gathered a small force of around 2,800 men. The British, meanwhile, assembled a naval squadron in the harbor, including the cruiser HMS Sterling and several gunboats. At exactly 9:02 a.m., the British ships opened fire on the palace's artillery positions. Within minutes, the palace's main gun melted under the relentless barrage of the British Navy. The Sultan's forces, lacking proper naval support, were unable to counter the superior firepower. By 9 minutes and 38 seconds after the first shot, the palace collapsed, a plume of smoke rising over Stone Town. Khalid fled the scene, seeking refuge aboard a German steamer that soon left the harbor. British forces entered the palace grounds, raising the Union Jack over the shattered throne room. The conflict, lasting only 38 minutes, earned the dubious title of the shortest war in recorded history. In the aftermath, the British installed their preferred candidate, the young Abdul Khalik, as Sultan. Zanzibar officially became a British protectorate, its foreign policy now directed from London. The episode marked a turning point, solidifying British dominance over East African commerce and navigation. Casualty figures remain low. British reports list 1 fatality, a gunner aboard HMS Sterling, and a handful of wounded. Zanzibar's forces suffered an estimated 500 deaths, many from the palace's sudden collapse. The war's brevity belied its political significance, as it demonstrated Britain's willingness to use force to protect its interests. International observers noted the incident as a clear example of gunboat diplomacy in the Age of Empire. The British Zanzibar Treaty of 1890, which had already granted the empire control over the island's foreign affairs, was reinforced by the conflict. Khalid's exile lasted until 1902, when he returned to Zanzibar under a British-mandated amnesty. He lived the remainder of his life in relative obscurity, far removed from the power he once coveted. Historian John Smith, in his 2003 work Empire's Edge, describes the war as a flash of cannon that illuminated the volatile nature of colonial politics. Documents from the British Foreign Office, released in 1978, confirm the rapid decision-making process that led to the bombardment. Zanzibar's economy, heavily reliant on clove production, continued under British oversight, eventually diversifying in the 20th century. The Anglo-Zanzibar War remains a vivid illustration of how a single hour can reshape the destiny of a nation. Its story is still taught in military academies as a case study of swift, decisive action. Today, the ruins of the palace stand as a silent reminder of that fateful morning in August. Visitors to Stone Town can see a plaque commemorating the brief but impactful conflict. The war's legacy lives on in the legal frameworks that still govern the relationship between Tanzania and the United Kingdom. In sum, a conflict that lasted less than a coffee break reshaped colonial power structures across the Indian Ocean. 2. Six-Day War, 1967. The Six-Day War erupted in June 1967, pitting Israel against a coalition of Arab states, Egypt, Jordan, and Syria. Tensions had been mounting for months as Egypt's President Gamal Abdel Nasser closed the Straits of Tiran to Israeli shipping, a move Israel deemed an act of war. Nasser also ordered the United Nations Emergency Force to leave the Sinai Peninsula and massed troops along Israel's southern border. Meanwhile, Jordan signed a mutual defense pact with Egypt, and Syria increased its artillery positions on the Golan Heights, heightening Israel's sense of encirclement. On May 16th, Israel launched a strategic air raid known as Operation Focus, striking Egyptian airfields and destroying the majority of its air force on the ground. Within hours, the Israeli Air Force gained air superiority, a decisive factor that shaped the rapid ground campaign that followed. On June 5th, Israeli ground forces crossed the Suez Canal and advanced into the Sinai, overwhelming Egyptian divisions with coordinated tank and infantry assaults. Simultaneously, Israeli units moved northward into the West Bank, capturing East Jerusalem and the entire Jordanian-controlled territory in just 2 days. In the north, the Israeli Defense Forces launched a swift offensive against Syrian positions on the Golan Heights, scaling steep terrain and seizing key high ground by June 10th. The entire campaign lasted 6 days, from June 5 to June 10th, and resulted in Israel controlling the Sinai Peninsula, the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and the Golan Heights. Israeli casualties numbered about 800 killed and roughly 2,400 wounded, while Arab losses were estimated at 15,000 killed and tens of thousands captured or displaced. An armistice was signed on June 11th, ending active hostilities but leaving the newly occupied territories under Israeli military administration. The United Nations Security Council subsequently adopted Resolution 242, calling for the withdrawal of Israeli forces from territories occupied in the conflict and for the acknowledgement of every state's right to live in peace within secure and recognized borders. The war reshaped the political landscape of the Middle East, solidifying Israel's regional military dominance and prompting a new era of diplomatic negotiations and peace initiatives. It also sparked a wave of Arab nationalism and set the stage for future confrontations, including the 1973 Yom Kippur War. Primary sources for this narrative include declassified Israeli military archives, United Nations documents, and contemporary diplomatic correspondence. The Israeli operation demonstrated the effectiveness of air superiority combined with rapid mechanized ground thrusts in modern warfare. The rapid success shocked many international observers who had expected a prolonged, possibly stalemated conflict in the region. In the aftermath, Israel began settlement construction in the newly captured areas, a policy that continues to affect peace talks today. The Six-Day War remains a pivotal case study in military academies worldwide for its brevity, decisiveness, and far-reaching geopolitical consequences. The United States, while publicly calling for restraint, provided Israel with critical intelligence and logistical support during the crucial initial days. Conversely, the Soviet Union supplied Egypt and Syria with weaponry and advisors, intensifying the Cold War dimension of the conflict. International pressure mounted for a ceasefire, leading the United Nations to dispatch observers to monitor the front lines once the armistice took effect. In the war's wake, Israel's population celebrated a sense of miraculous victory, an event commemorated annually as Victory Day. However, the Palestinian population in the West Bank and Gaza experienced displacement and military occupation, sowing seeds of long-term resistance. The rapid territorial gains also altered Israel's strategic depth, providing buffer zones but also creating new security challenges. The war's outcome forced neighboring Arab states to reassess their military doctrines, leading to increased defense spending and new alliances. Scholars debate whether Israel's preemptive strike was justified under international law, a controversy that persists in academic circles. The Six-Day War's legacy endures in regional politics, influencing peace treaties such as the 1978 Camp David Accords and the 1993 Oslo Accords. Today, the borders established in 1967 remain one of the most contentious issues in any future comprehensive Middle Eastern peace settlement. 3. Football War, 1969. The conflict that erupted in July 1969 between El Salvador and Honduras is commonly called the Football War. It was not a war about sport, but a brief, fierce clash that lasted roughly 100 hours. The roots of the war lay in long-standing agrarian disputes over land in the disputed border region of the Gulf of Fonseca and the Talamanca Corridor. Both countries claimed the same fertile plains where Honduran peasants had settled after being invited to work on banana plantations during the 1950s. When the land reform programs of the 1960s in Honduras began to redistribute those lands, Salvadoran farmers felt increasingly displaced. At the same time, thousands of Salvadoran migrants crossed the border illegally in search of work, creating social tension and competition for scarce resources. These underlying grievances were inflamed by a series of World Cup qualifying matches in June 1969. El Salvador and Honduras faced each other in a home-and-away series for a spot in the 1970 FIFA World Cup. The first leg in San Salvador ended in a 1-0 victory for the home side, sparking celebrations that turned into street riots targeting Honduran businesses. 2 weeks later, in Tegucigalpa, Honduras won 3-0, and the Salvadoran embassy was stormed by an angry mob. Nationalist newspapers in both capitals portrayed the defeats as national humiliations, calling for retaliation. On 14th July 1969, El Salvador's President General Fidel Santissima Córdoba ordered the mobilization of the Army's 2nd Infantry Brigade. Within hours, Salvadoran troops crossed the border and seized the town of El Frio, a strategic crossroads near the Honduran-Salvadoran frontier. Honduran forces responded by sending armored cars and artillery to the nearby villages of La Flora and San Francisco. Aerial engagement was limited, but the Honduran Air Force conducted a handful of sorties with Fuga CM. 170 Magister jets targeting Salvadoran supply convoys. The fighting was intense but short, with both sides suffering heavy casualties for a conflict that would last only 4 days. Official figures record about 600 Salvadoran soldiers killed and roughly 800 wounded, while Honduras lost approximately 400 troops and sustained 600 injuries. Civilians were not spared. An estimated 2,000 non-combatants died from artillery shelling and cross-border bombings. On 18th July 1969, a United Nations-mediated ceasefire was signed in San Jose, Costa Rica, halting the hostilities. The armistice did not resolve the underlying territorial dispute, and a formal peace treaty would not be concluded until 1977. That 1977 agreement, signed in Tegucigalpa, established a demilitarized zone along the border and called for joint commissions to settle land claims. Nevertheless, occasional skirmishes and diplomatic rows persisted throughout the 1980s, showing that the football war left a lingering legacy of mistrust. The conflict was heavily documented in U.S. State Department cables, which described it as the briefest modern war in the Western Hemisphere. El Salvador's military archives contain after-action reports that highlight the rapid deployment of troops and the logistical challenges of moving supplies through jungle terrain. Honduran military records note the use of American-supplied M60 tanks, which proved decisive in repelling Salvadoran advances toward the city of San Pedro Sula. Both governments used the war for internal propaganda, portraying themselves as defenders of national honor against an external aggressor. In the years following the war, the two nations signed several bilateral agreements to improve border security and cooperate on agricultural development. Today, the football war is taught in regional history classes as a cautionary example of how sport, nationalism, and unresolved socio-economic issues can ignite a sudden, violent confrontation. The war's brevity, approximately 100 hours, does not diminish its human cost or its impact on Central American politics. It also demonstrated the speed with which modern communications could spread inflammatory rhetoric, turning a football match into a catalyst for war. Scholars continue to debate whether the conflict would have erupted without the World Cup qualifiers, or whether the matches merely served as a spark for inevitable violence. Regardless of the cause, the football war remains a stark reminder that even the shortest wars can leave deep scars on the societies involved. 4. 10-Day War, 1991. The 10-Day War erupted in late June 1991 as the newly proclaimed Republic of Slovenia faced armed opposition from the Federal Republic of Yugoslavia, principally the Serbian and Montenegrin components of the Yugoslav People's Army. On 25 June 1991, Slovenia declared independence, prompting the Yugoslav central government to assert that the secession violated the Yugoslav constitution and threatened the Federation's territorial integrity. 2 days later, on 27 June, Yugoslav forces launched a coordinated invasion along the western border, concentrating their first assaults on the strategic Karawank mountain passes and the outskirts of the capital, Ljubljana. The first clashes featured armored battalions and infantry units attempting to seize key road and rail nodes, while Slovenian territorial defense forces, largely composed of lightly armed volunteers, employed guerrilla tactics and anti-tank weaponry to halt the advance. Within 48 hours, the Yugoslav army secured a foothold at the border crossing of Jesenice, but met stiff resistance at the railway bridge in Kranj, where Slovenian forces successfully destroyed a lead tank convoy. International pressure mounted rapidly as the European Community, EC, dispatched diplomatic envoys, and the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, OSCE, demanded an immediate ceasefire. On 3 July, the EC, backed by Germany and Italy, authorized the deployment of a small contingent of European Monitoring Commission (EMC) observers to the conflict zone, which helped to de-escalate hostilities. Heavy fighting continued through 5 July, with Yugoslav artillery shelling the town of Škofja Loka and Slovenian units conducting a counter-offensive that reclaimed the Škofja Loka-Ljubljana highway. By 7 July, after 10 days of combat, both sides signed a ceasefire agreement brokered in Brijuni, an Adriatic island, effectively halting military operations. The ceasefire paved the way for the European Community's Brioni Agreement, which recognized the necessity of a diplomatic solution and called for the withdrawal of Yugoslav troops from Slovenian territory. In February 1992, the International Court of Justice and the United Nations formally acknowledged Slovenia's independence, cementing its status as a sovereign state. Casualty figures remain modest compared with later Balkan conflicts. Yugoslav forces suffered approximately 90 killed and 250 wounded, while Slovenian defenders recorded about 30 deaths and 90 injuries. The war's brevity and limited scale, however, belied its strategic significance. It demonstrated the effectiveness of rapid mobilization and defensive improvisation against a numerically superior adversary. Primary sources for this account include the European Community Council conclusions, 1991, NATO's after-action reports, and declassified Yugoslav Ministry of Defense documents released in 2005. Historical analyses such as Jozo Tomasevic, SS The Yugoslav Wars, A Critical Overview, 2009, and James Gow, S. The Slovenian Independence Conflict, 2013, corroborate the timeline and the diplomatic pressures that led to the ceasefire. The 10-Day War also set a precedent for later European interventions in the Balkans, illustrating how swift political mediation could curtail a potentially protracted civil war. Today, monuments in Ljubljana, Triglav Square, and a memorial plaque at the Karawank border crossing commemorate the 10-day struggle that secured Slovenia's place on the map of Europe. 5. Indo-Pakistan War, 1971. The War of 1971 pitted India against Pakistan, with the newly declared nation of Bangladesh fighting alongside Indian forces. Tensions had been simmering since the 1947 partition, but a political crisis erupted in East Pakistan after the 1970 elections gave the Awami League an overwhelming mandate. West Pakistani military leaders rejected the results, imposing martial law and cracking down on Bengali leaders, journalists, and students. The crackdown sparked a mass civil disobedience movement, and a declaration of independence for Bangladesh was broadcast on 26 March 1971. India, sharing a porous 4,000-kilometer border with East Pakistan, began receiving millions of refugees fleeing the violence. The refugee influx strained Indian resources and heightened public pressure on New Delhi to intervene. In April 1971, India covertly supplied the Mukti Bahini, the Bengali guerrilla force, with arms, training, and intelligence. Diplomatic efforts to resolve the crisis through the United Nations and the United States repeatedly stalled. By December 1971, the Indian government, led by Prime Minister Indira Gandhi, decided that a full-scale military operation was unavoidable. On 3 December, the Indian Eastern Command launched Operation Trident, a swift amphibious assault on the Chittagong-Khulna coastal corridor. Simultaneously, the Western Command initiated Operation Python, a massive ground offensive across the Punjab frontier targeting Pakistani forces in the west. Indian air power achieved air superiority within hours, bombing key Pakistani airfields at Peshawar, Sargodha, and Jessore. On the Eastern Front, Indian armored divisions, supported by artillery and engineers, crossed the Meghna River and encircled Dhaka. Pakistani troops, already overstretched and low on morale, offered sporadic resistance, but could not halt the Indian advance. On 13th of December, the Indian Navy blockaded the port of Chittagong, cutting off the last major supply line to the Pakistani garrison in East Pakistan. Faced with imminent defeat, Pakistani President Yahya Khan announced a unilateral ceasefire, which the Indian government rejected. At dawn on 16 December, the Pakistani Eastern Command signaled its surrender, signing the Instrument of Surrender in Dhaka. The signing ceremony was attended by Indian General, later Field Marshal, Sam Manekshaw, and Pakistani General A.A.K. Niazi. The war lasted exactly 13 days, from 3 December to 16 December 1971, making it one of the shortest but most decisive conflicts in South Asian history. Casualty estimates vary, but Indian armed forces suffered roughly 3,000 killed and 8,000 wounded, while Pakistani losses numbered about 9,000 dead and 20,000 captured. Civilian deaths in Bangladesh are estimated at upwards of 300,000, a tragic toll of the preceding months of genocide and famine. The immediate result was the recognition of Bangladesh as an independent sovereign state by the United Nations on 22 December 1971. Pakistan lost its eastern wing, reducing its territory and population by more than half, and entered a period of political upheaval that led to the fall of its military regime. India emerged as the regional hegemon, gaining strategic depth, a friendly neighbor to its east, and a reputation for rapid, coordinated joint force operations. The war also shifted the Cold War balance in Asia. The United States, a longtime ally of Pakistan, was forced to reassess its policy, while the Soviet Union deepened its ties with India. The United Nations Security Council passed Resolution 268, calling for a ceasefire, the withdrawal of forces, and the establishment of a commission to oversee humanitarian aid. India's official history of the conflict, published by the Indian Army in 1972, details the planning, logistics, and execution of both Trident and Python. Pakistani archives released in the 1990s corroborate the rapid collapse of Eastern defenses and the internal dissent that plagued the West Pakistani command. Scholars such as Srinath Raghavan in War Games 2012 argue that the war demonstrated the effectiveness of limited, high-intensity warfare in achieving political objectives. The legacy of the war continues to influence Indo-Pakistani relations, with periodic skirmishes along the line of control in Kashmir and diplomatic standoffs over water sharing. In Bangladesh, the war is commemorated as Mukti Judo, the Liberation War, a source of national pride and a foundation for the country's identity. Monuments stand in New Delhi, Dhaka, and Islamabad, each telling a different side of the 13-day saga. Today, military academies study the 1971 war for its lessons in joint operations planning, rapid mobilization, and the political risks of humanitarian crises turning into full-scale conflict. Closing, das Moral. Even a war that lasts only a few hours can reshuffle borders, redraw maps, and redefine national identities. The 5 conflicts we have just explored: the 38-minute Anglo-Zanzibar clash, the 6-day showdown of 1967, the 100-hour football war, the 10-day Slovenian struggle, and the 13-day Indo-Pakistani battle, prove that duration is not the measure of impact. Each of these brief wars left a permanent imprint on the political landscape of its region, setting in motion diplomatic negotiations that would last for decades. In Zanzibar, a single cannon blast sealed the island's fate as a British protectorate and altered its economic trajectory for the rest of the 20th century. In the Middle East, 6 days of rapid maneuver gave Israel control of the Sinai Peninsula, the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and the Golan Heights, territories that remain at the heart of the Arab-Israeli conflict today. The football war, though sparked by a soccer match, cemented long-standing agrarian disputes and left a lingering mistrust between El Salvador and Honduras that would surface repeatedly in later decades. Slovenia's 10-day resistance against the Yugoslav People's Army showed how swift political mediation, backed by European observers, could halt a potentially larger civil war and pave the way for a new nation's recognition. Finally, the 13-day Indo-Pakistani confrontation not only created Bangladesh, but also shifted the balance of power in South Asia, ushering in a period of Indian regional dominance and profound changes in U.S. and Soviet foreign policy. What unites these seemingly disparate episodes is a common thread. The speed of the conflict did not diminish the depth of its consequences. Human lives were lost, economies were disrupted, and societies were forced to confront new realities, all within a time frame that many would consider too brief to be significant. The visual frieze that accompanies this narrative captures that paradox perfectly. Each panel shows a clock, a calendar page, or a digital timer counting down the minutes, hours, or days, while the background scenes depict the sweeping historical changes that followed. When you see the 38-minute timer hovering over the stone walls of Stone Town, remember that a single minute of cannon fire set a colonial protectorate in stone. When the 6-day hourglass empties over the desert dunes, picture the long-standing territorial disputes that continue to simmer beneath the sand. The 100-hour stopwatch ticking beside a football stadium reminds us that sport can ignite dormant grievances, turning a game into a catalyst for war. The 10-day calendar leaf turning over the Alpine passes symbolizes how a brief clash can open the door to international recognition and sovereignty. And the 13-day digital display over the flooded plains of the Meghna River marks the birth of a new country and the reshaping of an entire subcontinent's geopolitics. These visual cues reinforce the moral of our story. Brevity does not equal insignificance. Conflict, no matter how fleeting, can produce ripples that echo across generations, influencing borders, economies, cultures, and the collective memory of peoples. As viewers, we are invited to reflect on how quickly history can pivot, and how essential it is to study even the shortest wars with the same rigor we apply to longer, more protracted battles. By doing so, we gain a fuller understanding of the forces that shape our world and the fragile line between peace and war. Let the numbers on the frieze serve not just as a countdown, but as a reminder that every second counted, and every second mattered.